The tail section sat at an angle in the sand, maybe 40 miles southwest of Baghdad, scorched along one edge where the fuel had cooked off. Soviet-built MiG-29, the variant NATO called Fulcrum, one of the best dogfighters the Warsaw Pact ever pushed out a factory door. The vertical stabilizer still carried part of the Iraqi Air Force roundel, faded green and red under a film of grit. Whoever recovered the piece never found a full airframe to go with it. The aircraft had come apart in the air, which is what happens when a missile detonates inside the engine bay at better than 2,000 miles an hour. The detail that matters most isn't in the wreckage. The Iraqi pilot almost certainly never saw the thing that killed him. The killer was an F-15's Eagle, and it had been watching him for several minutes before it fired. It hadn't closed to the merge or a turning fight, and it stayed outside anywhere the Fulcrum's own radar could paint it. From roughly 40 miles out, a distance where the Eagle was nothing more than a contact on a screen that the Iraqi either couldn't see or didn't trust. If you flew over that desert during those weeks and watched any of this unfold, or you knew one of the men who did, your account is worth more than any after-action report I can quote. The comments are open, and I read them. Subscribe, drop a like, and tell me what the official record left out. The Eagle was designed for exactly this, and the design intent was lopsided from the start. McDonnell Douglas built the F-15 in the early 1970s around a single obsession: kill the other aircraft before it knows you exist. The slogan inside the program was, "Not a pound for air-to-ground," meaning they refused to compromise the jet's air superiority mission for anything. Two enormous Pratt & Whitney F-100 engines, a wing area wide enough that the thing could climb nearly straight up, and a radar, the AN/APG-63, that could find a fighter-sized target far enough away to set up a shot the enemy couldn't answer. The Eagle did not want a fair fight. It was engineered to make sure no fair fight ever happened. The Iraqi pilots flew good machines and were poorly served by almost everything around them. Their MiG-29 was fast, agile, and carried a decent infrared search system, but Iraqi ground controllers fed pilots their picture of the sky, and the moment American jamming and anti-radar strikes tore that ground network apart, those pilots went up half-blind. A Fulcrum without its controller talking was a knife fighter walking into a room where the other man had a rifle and the lights were off. Some of them knew it. The records show several simply ran for the Iranian border rather than turn and fight, which tells you how the men at the controls rated their own odds. That tail in the sand belonged to one who didn't run, or didn't run fast enough. So the wreckage is the ending. A scorched piece of a world-class fighter, killed by a weapon its pilot may never have detected, in a war where the gap between two air forces turned out to be wider than anyone outside a few American briefing rooms expected. The question worth answering is not whether the Eagle was better. Everybody knows that now. The question is why the distance between them was so enormous, and why dozens of Iraqi pilots died before they ever got close enough to matter. Captain Jon Kelk flipped his RPG-63 to radiate somewhere over northern Saudi Arabia in the first hours of January 17, 1991, and the desert below turned into a problem the Iraqis didn't know they had yet. The Eagle's radar reached out past the horizon, sweeping a cone of sky 100 miles deep, and it began sorting metal from empty air. Kelk would log the first aerial kill of the war that night. A MiG-29, dead before its pilot grasped what was hunting him. To understand why that happened, go back to the drawing boards and the men who fought over them. The F-15 exists because the United States got a nasty surprise. Soviet engineers rolled out the MiG-25 Foxbat in the late 60s, and Western intelligence, working off blurry photographs and bad assumptions, decided it was a monster. A fast, high-flying dogfighter that would eat American jets alive. They were wrong, as it turned out, but the panic was productive. The Air Force wanted an answer, and it wanted one that gave up nothing. That stubbornness produced the program's defining rule. The chief of the development effort, Major General Benjamin Bellis, ran his shop under a phrase that became gospel: "Not a pound for air-to-ground." Every time someone suggested hanging bombs on the new fighter, the answer was no. Weight that didn't help the jet kill other aircraft was weight that didn't belong. The Pentagon has rarely shown that kind of discipline before or since, and the result was an airframe with a thrust-to-weight ratio above 1, meaning the Eagle could point its nose at the sky and accelerate straight up, climbing like the ground had let go of it. The radar was the real weapon, though. The APG-63 could detect a fighter-sized target at better than 80 miles and feed that information straight into the AIM-7 Sparrow and later the AIM-120. The range numbers tell only part of it. What the pilot actually saw tells the rest. Inside the cockpit at night, the scope threw a soft green wash across the instrument panel and the underside of the pilot's visor, and every contact in a 100-mile radius showed up as a small symbol he could study at leisure. He knew the enemy's altitude, heading, and speed before that enemy knew an American was airborne. The glow made him a god of information, sitting in the dark with a complete picture while the other man flew blind. There's a particular arrogance to that kind of advantage, and the Eagle community earned every bit of it. The F-15 would finish its combat career with over 100 kills and not a single loss in air-to-air combat. The Iraqis had nothing like it. Their best radars were tied to the ground, and their pilots were trained to do what the controller said and little else. So, the fight, before a single missile flew, was already decided by two design philosophies. One Air Force built a machine to make its pilot omniscient, while the other built pilots to be obedient. Kelk's MiG never had a chance, and neither did most of the ones that followed it into that sky. In Baghdad, the numbers looked formidable on paper. Iraq fielded the largest air force in the region by the end of the 1980s, more than 700 combat aircraft, a mix of Soviet and French steel that had survived 8 grinding years of war with Iran. MiG-29's and MiG-25's from Moscow, Mirage F1's from France, Sukhoi attack jets, the whole catalog of what petrodollars could buy. On a ramp lined up in the sun, it was an intimidating sight. The problem wasn't the metal, it was the wiring that connected the metal to a human being. Iraq had imported its air defense thinking wholesale from the Soviet Union, and the Soviet model put the brain on the ground. A pilot was a sensor and a trigger, vectored toward his target by a controller staring at a radar scope in a bunker, told when to climb, when to turn, when to shoot. Initiative was not a virtue in that system. It was a way to get yelled at, or worse. One Iraqi officer captured the mindset after the war, talking to interrogators about how missions were flown. "We did not move without permission," he said. "To act alone was to be wrong." To act alone was to be wrong. The French had sold the Iraqis a beautiful interceptor in the Mirage F1, a jet with a capable radar and a pilot's eye cockpit, and the Iraqi system took that machine and told the man flying it to wait for instructions. You can buy the finest rifle in the world and still lose if doctrine forbids you from aiming it yourself. The MiG-25 made the contrast brutal. The Foxbat that once terrified Western planners turned out to be a high-altitude sprinter, built around a ground-controlled intercept, blisteringly fast in a straight line and clumsy at anything else. It needed someone on the radio to point it at the enemy. Strip away the controller and the thing was a missile without a guidance package, screaming through the dark with nobody to tell it where the threat was. The fatal dependency was no secret to the Americans, who knew about it before the first bomb fell. The opening hours of the air campaign weren't really aimed at the fighters at all. They were aimed at the bunkers, the radars, the phone lines, the men in headsets who told Iraqi pilots where to look. Cut those, and 700 aircraft became 700 blind men. The Iraqi pilot who scrambled on the second night was flying a fine machine into a fight his own air force had already lost on the ground. 300 feet over the berm that marked the Saudi border, a wall of strike aircraft pushed north into Iraqi airspace, and not one of those crews was looking at his own radar to stay alive. He was listening. The voice in his headset came from an E-3 Sentry, an AWACS, orbiting safely back over Saudi territory with a 30-foot radar dome turning on its spine and a dozen controllers hunched over scopes inside the fuselage. That airplane could see farther than any fighter ever built, and it was about to hand each Eagle crew the entire sky on a plate. The arrangement had a name the planners liked: the kill web. Strip the poetry off it, and it was just radar, radio, and datalink stitched together so that no American flew blind. The sentry watched everything. When an Iraqi fighter rolled down a runway and lifted off, the AWACS controller saw the contact bloom on his scope, tagged it, and passed it to whichever F-15 was best positioned to kill it. The Eagle pilot didn't even have to turn on his own radar yet. He got the picture for free, vectored onto a target that had already been sorted and handed to a shooter without ever knowing it. Behind the fighters sat the unglamorous half of the machine, and it mattered more than anyone outside the planning cells liked to admit. Tankers, KC-135s and KC-10s flying lazy racetracks south of the border, hauling fuel so the Eagles could stay on station for hours instead of the 40-odd minutes a thirsty F-15 burns through at military power. An F-15 with full tanks and afterburner-lit drinks like a house on fire. Without the tankers, the whole net would have run dry in an hour, and the Iraqis would have gotten their open sky back by simple arithmetic. So, while fighter pilots collected the kills and the medals, a kid flying a 40-year-old Boeing in a fuel orbit was the reason any of it worked. The Iraqis had nothing that could touch this. Their early warning radars were either already smoking craters or shut down out of terror, because the moment one lit up, a high-speed anti-radiation missile came homing down the beam toward the antenna. The men in the bunkers learned fast that turning the radar on was a way to die. So they left it off, which meant they couldn't see either. The choice was blindness or death, and they mostly chose blindness. Picture the geometry from the Iraqi side for a moment. A MiG-29 pilot lifts off into the dark, climbs through a few thousand feet, and reaches for his controller on the radio. Nothing. The bunker that's supposed to tell him where the enemy is has been bombed flat, or the controller is alive but staring at a dead scope, or the radio is jammed into a wash of static. He's alone. His own radar reaches out maybe 50 miles in a narrow cone, and he has to choose where to point it, guessing in a sky he can't see. 40 miles away, an Eagle already has him boxed, tracked, and ranged, with a Sparrow coming off the rail in a few seconds. He will get one warning at best, a chirp from a threat receiver, and by then the missile is most of the way to him. The exchange ratio that first night reads like a misprint, and the records hold up. Coalition fighters knocked Iraqi aircraft out of the air and lost none of their own to enemy fighters. One Eagle pilot, debriefing later, described firing on a contact he never saw with his eyes at all. Just a symbol on a scope and a tone in his ears, and watching the symbol disappear. "I never got a tally," he said, meaning he never laid eyes on the airplane he killed. He didn't need to. The net had already done the seeing. That was the whole point of the design, and the Iraqis walked into it one takeoff at a time. The men flying south to Iran weren't cowards. They were the ones who'd done the math fastest. The ones who climbed north to fight were brave, professional, and dead because courage doesn't help when the other man can see in the dark and you can't. First look, first shot, first kill. That was the phrase Eagle pilots used to describe what they trained for, and over Iraq it stopped being a slogan and became simple arithmetic. The math came down to range, and range is where the fight was won before anyone merged. The APG-63 could pick a fighter out of the clutter at better than 80 miles. The AIM-7 Sparrow it fed could reach out and kill at 20 to 30, depending on the geometry and how fast the two airplanes were closing. An Iraqi radar, when its pilot dared switch it on at all, might find an Eagle at 40 miles in a good cone, and then he still had to identify it, get permission, and set up a shot. The American had already done all of that and pulled the trigger. That gap meant something concrete in the cockpit. The Eagle driver sees the contact, locks it, confirms it's hostile through the AWACS picture, and squeezes off a Sparrow while the Iraqi is still sweeping his scope across empty sky, looking for something that's already shooting at him. The Sparrow itself was no marvel of elegance. Semi-active homing, which meant the missile didn't carry its own radar. It rode the beam the Eagle painted onto the target, following the reflected energy home. The catch was ugly. The F-15 had to keep its nose pointed at the target, illuminating it the whole way, or the missile went stupid and flew off into nothing. Earlier in Vietnam, that limitation had made the Sparrow a frustrating, unreliable weapon, missing far more than it hit. By 1991, the missile had grown up. The AIM-7M model had a new guidance section and a fuse that actually worked, and against an Iraqi fighter flying straight and predictable, vectored by no one. It was lethal in a way the old Vietnam-era rounds never managed. The kill probabilities, the Air Force logged that war embarrassed the numbers from 20 years earlier. What gets lost in the highlight reels is that most of these kills happened beyond visual range, which meant the dogfight, the twisting, turning, guns, and nerve contest that every movie sells, simply never occurred. The Eagle never had to outturn the Fulcrum, and that mattered because the MiG-29 was the more agile airplane in a close-in knife fight. Soviet engineers built the Fulcrum to dance, for exactly the kind of fight the Americans refused to give it. The refusal was deliberate, written into doctrine and drilled into every Eagle squadron for a decade. Kill him at 40 miles, and his agility is a spec sheet that never gets tested. Let him inside 10, and you've thrown away your entire advantage to fight on his terms. American pilots had no intention of being that stupid, and the AWACS picture meant they almost never had to be. So the Iraqi pilot's best quality, the thing his airplane was actually superior at, was made irrelevant by distance. He brought a knife that was sharper than the American's knife. The American brought a rifle and never let him get close enough to draw. One Iraqi MiG-29, on the third night, reportedly fired a missile of his own before he died in completely the wrong direction, at a contact that wasn't there. The records on that one are thin and the gun camera footage is ambiguous. What's clear is that he was shooting blind, and 40 miles away, someone wasn't. 300 contacts at once. That's the number a single E-3 crew could hold on their scopes and sort. Friend from foe, climbing from descending, threat from airliner, across an arc of sky that ran past Baghdad and out the other side of the country. One airplane. The whole war laid out like a map on a table. Inside the fuselage, behind the spinning dome, a dozen weapons controllers sat in a dim cabin lit by green phosphor, each one owning a slice of the picture. They weren't pilots. Most of them never touched a stick in their lives. They were traffic cops with God's own view of the intersection, and they decided which Eagle got vectored onto which contact, who held, who pushed, who came home for gas. The Iraqis had built their entire system around a few ground stations seeing a narrow piece of the sky each, stitched together by phone lines and discipline. The Americans put the whole thing in the air, mobile, beyond the reach of any bomb, looking down so ground clutter couldn't hide a low-flying fighter the way it hid one from a radar sitting on the desert floor. Downlook was the trick the Soviets never solved cheaply, and the Sentry had it. So, every Iraqi takeoff became a published flight plan. The wheels left the runway, the contact bloomed on a controller's scope before the gear was up, and somewhere 100 miles south, an Eagle got a heading and a target before the Iraqi pilot finished his climb checklist. Think about what that does to a man's odds. He cannot lift off without being seen, cannot turn toward the fight without someone already turning to meet him, cannot run without being tracked all the way to the ground. The sky he flies into has been measured and assigned, and his airplane is a number on a scope that an American teenager in a headset is about to hand to a shooter. The controllers talked in a clipped, flat shorthand that betrayed none of it. Bandit, bullseye 340, 40, hot. Bearing and range from a reference point both crews had memorized, the word hot meaning the contact was coming at them. An Eagle pilot heard that and didn't have to find anything. He had to point his airplane and wait for the lock. There's a recording from one of those nights, an AWACS controller walking a flight of F-15's onto a pair of Iraqi fighters, and what strikes you is how bored he sounds. No drama, no urgency in the voice. The same tone a man uses reading off a grocery list while he arranges the deaths of two pilots 40 miles away who have no idea he exists. That was the decisive edge, more than the radar in the Eagle's nose or the missile under its wing. The Iraqis flew into a war where one side could see all of it, and the other side, half the time, couldn't even see the man about to kill him. The cockpit smells like rubber and cold sweat and the faint plastic tang of the oxygen feed. And at 30,000 feet over western Iraq, the only light is the green wash of the radar scope and a string of caution lamps the pilot has learned to ignore. His left hand rides the throttles. His right thumb hovers over the castle switch on the stick, the little four-way hat that slews his radar and steps through his weapons without his eyes ever leaving the display. The AWACS voice arrives flat in his ears. Bandit, bullseye, range, hot. He rolls into the cut, pulls the nose around to put the threat on the nose, and the airframe groans the way an F-15 does under load. A deep structural complaint you feel in your spine before you hear it. He doesn't see an airplane. He sees a brick of light crawling down the scope toward a number that means death. Now the dance, and it's all geometry. He bumps the radar into a tighter scan to hold the contact, confirms through the datalink and the controller's call that the brick is hostile, and at about 40 miles, he commits. The Sparrow needs the radar locked and the nose pointed, so he disciplines himself to fly the intercept clean. No wild maneuvering, just a steady closing geometry that keeps the missile fed. Lock tone. He squeezes the trigger and holds it, and the AIM-7 leaves the rail with a flash that whites out his night vision for half a second and a thump that shoves the whole airplane sideways. Then he flies the most counterintuitive maneuver in the business, which is to keep boring straight at a man he just shot at, because the missile is semi-active, and goes blind the instant he breaks the lock. So he holds, eyes on the brick, counting. 30 miles away, an Iraqi pilot, name unrecorded in anything declassified, gets the only piece of information he will ever receive about this fight. A chirp in his headset from a threat receiver that has just detected the Eagle's radar burning a hole in him. By then, the Sparrow is most of the way there. He has seconds, and he doesn't know which direction to throw them. He could brake, dump chaff, dive for the deck, but he's reacting to a missile already in its terminal phase, fired by a man he cannot see, vectored by a man he doesn't know exists, and the physics of the thing was settled before his threat lamp were ever lit. The records that survive from the Iraqi side are thin to non-existent on these intercepts. Most of these men left no account at all. The brick on the Eagle pilot's scope smears and breaks apart, and the lock falls off because there's nothing coherent left to reflect the beam. That's the whole confirmation he gets. A target that stops being a target. The AWACS controller calls the splash in the same grocery list voice. The pilot rolls out, gulps oxygen, scans his fuel, and turns back toward the tanker track, because the clock that governs his war isn't the Iraqi, it's the fuel gauge. And an Eagle that fights too long and misses its tanker becomes the most expensive glider in the inventory. There was no merge, no canopy-to-canopy pass, no tracers, no rolling scissors, none of the thing the word dogfight conjures. A man flew a precise arc through the dark, pressed a trigger, held a heading for 20 long seconds, and another man died 40 miles away without ever seeing the airplane that killed him. Multiply that single intercept by the score of times it played out across the war's opening week. The pattern never broke, because nothing the Iraqis brought into the sky could break it. The Eagle drivers weren't braver than the men they killed. They were positioned, informed, and armed for a fight the other side couldn't even locate. And they pulled the trigger first every single time it mattered. Over the western deserts, in the last days of January, the killing reached a tempo that even the men doing it found unsettling. This was the stretch of sky where Iraqi pilots tried to run. Not toward the fight, away from it, west and then north toward the Iranian border, where a strange arrangement let them land and be interned rather than burned out of the air. Saddam's Air Force voted with its throttles. More than 100 aircraft eventually fled to the country they'd spent 8 years bombing, which tells you everything about how the men in those cockpits rated their odds at home. The ones who didn't run fast enough died on the way. Captain Cesar Rodriguez, who finished the war with 3 credited kills, described the rhythm of it in plain terms years later. We were shooting them before they even knew we were there. No triumph in the phrasing, just the mechanics. The Eagles set up west of the fleeing formations, the AWACS handed off the contacts, and the Sparrows reached out across 40 miles of nothing and plucked the runners down one at a time. Picture the geometry from above. A pair of MiG-23s clawing for altitude, noses pointed east toward sanctuary. Pilots who have already decided the war is lost and want only to live through the next 10 minutes. Behind and above them, contacts they cannot see, closing at a combined speed that eats the distance faster than a man can think. The threat receiver chirps. One of them breaks. It doesn't matter. The missile was launched before the lamp lit. A British Jaguar pilot who watched a slice of this from his own cockpit said the desert that week was lit by burning aircraft the way a runway is lit by approach lights, regular, spaced, going down at intervals. His word was methodical. The Americans weren't hunting, they were harvesting. The bitter arithmetic of the whole campaign lay bare in those final intercepts. The MiG-29 could outturn an Eagle inside a mile. The Mirage carried a decent radar of its own. The men flying them had survived a war that killed pilots by the hundred. None of it reached the fight. Every advantage the Iraqis owned lived inside 10 miles, and the Americans simply refused to come inside 10 miles, killing instead from a range where courage and stick skill and a sharper turn rate counted for exactly nothing. 33 confirmed air-to-air kills against fixed-wing Iraqi aircraft over the war. The F-15 accounted for most of them. American losses in air-to-air combat, 0. Not one Eagle fell to an enemy fighter, in this war or any other. The men who died over the Western Desert weren't cowards and weren't incompetents. They were soldiers handed a hopeless tool against an enemy who had spent 15 years and a national fortune making sure the fight would never be fair. It wasn't. That was the entire point. Rory Drager rolled his Eagle east across the empty quarter and chased the published flight plan of men who only wanted to live. It was late January, and the border with Iran had become the busiest piece of sky in the theater because every Iraqi pilot with a working airplane and a functioning instinct for self-preservation was pointed at it. Drager and his flight set the trap the way they always did, low and west and silent on the radio, letting the AWACS feed them the picture while they closed. The MiG-23 is a fast airplane in a straight line, a swing-wing interceptor the Soviets built to bolt toward a target and run home. And on this morning, a flight of them was doing exactly what it was designed to do. Wings swept back, throttles firewalled, burning for the one stretch of horizon that meant internment instead of a funeral. They never had the gas margin to maneuver and the speed to escape at the same time. They chose speed. It fed them straight into the missile basket. The first one went without ceremony. Then the fireball bloomed on the eastern horizon, a hard orange flash low against the brown haze that flattened and spread and hung there a moment too long before the smoke caught up with it. And from a cockpit miles back, it looked less like an explosion than like a struck match held against the rim of the world. The wingmen saw it too. That's the moment the records can only guess at because no Iraqi account of these last runs survives in anything declassified. But the physics writes the rest. He watched his leader become a smear of burning kerosene in the air ahead, knew with total clarity that the same thing was already inbound for him, and had nowhere to put the knowledge. Turning back meant the war he was fleeing. Climbing only made him a cleaner target, and the dirt was already close beneath him. So, he held his heading and pushed his throttles harder, racing a missile he couldn't see toward a border he wouldn't reach, and the chirp in his headset was the last new thing the war ever told him. The second fireball came a few seconds after the first. The Eagles rolled out and turned for the tanker. Fuel state nominal. And the controller logged 2 splashes in the bored flat voice that by now sounded like the war itself. This was the day the thing stopped being combat in any sense the word can carry. A man fighting for his life has options, even bad ones, even ones that only delay him. And the Iraqis over the eastern desert that week had run clean out of options before they ever left the runway. They were not being defeated. They were being processed, sorted off a scope, vectored, locked, and removed, one orange flash at a time, by men who never saw their faces and felt nothing in particular about it because there was nothing to feel, no contest in it, no risk to weigh. Just the steady mechanical harvest of an air force that had decided to flee and discovered that fleeing was its own kind of execution. More than 130 Iraqi aircraft made it across to Iran and sat out the war on enemy soil, which is the closest thing to a victory their pilots managed, surviving by surrendering the sky entirely. The ones who didn't make it left no wreckage worth the name. Just scattered metal cooling in the sand along a line that pointed east, every nose aimed the same hopeless direction. Saddam had spent 15 years and a fortune in oil money, assembling the largest air force in the region. French radar and Soviet engines and pilots blooded in 8 years of war. And in the end, the machine's finest hour was the morning it learned to run fast enough to be interned by Tehran. The men who flew it weren't the problem. The men who built the system they flew into never gave them a fight they could win. And somewhere over the eastern border, watching his leader burn and knowing his turn had come, one Iraqi pilot understood that better than any planner in Baghdad ever would. The threat lamp lit. He had a few seconds left, and he spent them flying straight toward a country he'd once bombed, hoping it would take him alive. 39 fixed-wing kills, coalition total, 0 F-15 losses to enemy aircraft. That's the line from the post-war tally, stripped of everything that made it happen, and it reads like a typo. Air combat isn't supposed to look like that. Even lopsided wars leave the winner bleeding a little. A few crews who got jumped or flew into the ground chasing a target or simply ran out of luck on a bad night. The Eagle's ledger had none of that. Of the air-to-air victories, the F-15 claimed the overwhelming majority, better than 30 of them, and the great bulk were killed beyond visual range. The enemy erased from a scope before the two airplanes ever shared the same patch of sky. Run the comparison the other way and it gets stranger. In Vietnam, a generation earlier, American fighters traded with MiG-21s at something close to 1 for 2 in the worst stretches, and pilots came home with gun camera film of canopies they could read the rivets on. That was air combat as the word had always meant it. Knife, fight, close. Both men sweating, both men with a vote. Over Iraq, the vote got taken away. The machine that Jon Kelk switched on over Saudi Arabia in the first hour had rewritten the rules so completely that the enemy's skill, his airframe, his 8 years of combat experience, all of it landed outside the equation before he left the runway.